Welcome, I'm Jon Caldara, president of the Independence Institute and your devil's advocate. A little later in the show, we'll square off with the Denver Post over endorsements and all the wonderful questions on your ballot, which are due Tuesday. Don't mess it up now. But first, I want to talk about a great story that Channel 9 has unearthed, fighting with. I'm not too sure how to put it. Chris Vanderveen, thank you for being with us.
John, thanks for having me here. It's a big topic. We're talking about child welfare. But we felt like this was an issue that felt like it needed a little bit more attention.
And also, this has some interesting policy connotations, which interests me on this. But let's go through this. Let me set it up and tell me how right I am. 2006, a common law couple here in Denver has their kids removed from their home.
Correct.
The house was in squalor. The kids couldn't really speak. They never learned how to speak. They talked in grunts. You know, there was feces on the floor. It was a bad scene. Government comes in and does, I think, what government should do, although it scares me when government comes and grabs kids. You know, that is a high hurdle. Take it from there. Bring it to what's happening now with the same couple.
It's a bit complex, but I'll try to boil it down a little bit. Same couple, so they have 3 kids taken away. They're eventually taken away in 2009. But between 2006 and 2009, they proceed to have 2 more kids. Those kids are allowed to stay in the house. And after 2009, they have 2 more kids. So there's 4 kids living in the house in 2013, just a month ago, when Denver police shows up at the house with kids living in basically, they're alleging the same kind of situation. House is a mess. Kids are nonverbal. In this case, there's a child that's 6 years old. They all range between the ages of 2 and 6. And for some people, they say this is a sad case of history repeating itself, that we saw this happening in 2006. 3 kids were taken away. 2013, almost identical story as being alleged by the Denver Police Department. And we started asking, well, how could this happen? And should it happen? And we sort of run into some roadblocks.
When you say should it happen, there's no law that stops ill-equipped parents from reproducing. You know, if this is a case, and we don't know, it hasn't been adjudicated, but if these are truly bad parents, and I would suspect they are, when you say, what's the city supposed to do? You can't tell people or force them into sterilization. You know, this is a sad situation. What do you mean what the city should have done?
Well, there's some question as to what is the obligation. And there are good arguments on both sides here. But the question being, what is the obligation of Denver Human Services to sort of keep track of a family that they have run-ins with in the past? They're well aware of this family. We spoke with it. Part of the reason why we got in some issue with Denver Human Services is that we spoke with a former caseworker at Denver Human Services who told us he believed that no children should ever go back to this home. And he said that he was ignored by the leadership at Denver Human Services.
All right, so here's the investigative story. A caseworker talks to you and says, listen, we said we got to keep an eye on these people. We said they shouldn't have any more kids, but Human Services didn't keep up with them. They didn't do their job. That's the accusation.
But the possibility is, and here's where the frustrating part comes from a journalist perspective, we're all in favor of transparency, is that we don't know. It is entirely possible that Denver Human Services did everything they could to check up on this family. But you simply can't ask that question of Denver Human Services because of confidentiality issues. And some of them are great. They're designed to protect the children.
And I understand that. You know, this is a highly personal issue. You can't say, hey, have you checked to see if they're a bad parent? But Denver Health Services didn't like you looking into this. Tell me that part of the story.
Well, so we had told them a couple days before that we were going to be doing an interview with a former caseworker of theirs. We told them the name of the caseworker because I wanted to make sure that this person actually worked there for the years that he said that he worked there. 2 days later, the day that we're going to run the story, we get a notice. I call it a warning from the attorney for Denver Human Services telling us, reminding us that if we air anything confidential in our story, then not only does the former caseworker face the possibility of a Class 1 misdemeanor, which, as I've now been reminded, is punishable by up to 6 months in jail, but we face the possibility of criminal prosecution as well. And that's highly unusual for a journalist organization to receive a letter from a city agency warning us that we face the possibility of jail time. They tell us that they were simply reminding us of the law. But it didn't come across as threatening.
You know the law, I'm assuming.
Yes.
You understand this, and if you break the law, they have every right to file a complaint and bring you to justice. a letter from the attorney. I love this. The letter from the attorney from Denver Health Services. Why didn't they just pick up the phone?
Well, it was a question that I asked, and it's, there's a lesson in PR here, perhaps, that maybe when you're dealing with people, sometimes the best approach is to talk to them.
Nah.
Why would we do that?
Why would we do
that? But so we.
Now, did you get the feeling that Denver Health Services was trying to squash the story?
No.
That they didn't want this story? I mean, it is embarrassing and it's tragic if this potentially abusive couple has 4 more children, and if the city knew about it or had a warning about it, particularly in these days after the Aurora shooting and heightened about we've got to keep an eye on mental health issues. That's a big accusation. I can understand why a department wouldn't want that aired.
I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt here, that they are simply explaining the law to us. It did come across as a warning to us. We made a story out of it, as journalists are going to do if you give that kind of a letter, and I think they knew that if you give that kind of a letter
they got that? I mean, if you're going to give a reporter a cease and desist letter, I mean,
it's going to become part of the story. Why not?
It's giving candy to a baby. It's
Why?
like,
Exactly.
oh, this is now more interesting. All right, let's advance this story because it has a few different twists to it. So not only do you have questions as a reporter of what's going on in this department, and did they know? What did they know? When did they know it? If they had to get these kids again. I mean, understandable questions, but I'll agree, personal questions.
Sure.
And there are confidentiality issues. Absolutely. You're not the only one interested in what's going on in Denver Health Services. Who else?
The Denver Auditor, the week before we aired our story, had become so frustrated, and I think frustrated is the appropriate word here. Maybe not. Maybe it's a little bit too tame, but became so frustrated with Denver Human Services that they went to an unprecedented level with Dennis Gallagher's office, and they said, "Look, we can't get information that we need for our audit of you. We just want to make sure that you're spending money wisely."
All right,
as the auditor's office is supposed to do.
Let me see if I understand it. Denver has a city auditor's office.
Correct.
This is an independent organization, independent department, independently elected. The idea is that, like a good CPA, their job is to poke around and see if all the papers are filed the right way, if the money's being spent, if there's nothing funny going on. There's a department, Denver Health Services. I'm calling it the right thing, all right?
Denver Human Services.
Denver Human Services. And their job at the auditor's office is to keep a look at the city, including the city's Human Services
And they've
department.
been asking for records for a while, and Denver Human Services has told them, nope, can't get it. So what happens is, the week before we air our story, Denver Auditor says, okay, fine, we're going to sue you. And they've taken that step to go towards the Denver Human Services and said, if you're going to keep this secret, we're going to do this unprecedented step, and we're going to sue you. Now the question is,
you got one side of the city government suing another side of the city government over simple transparency.
Yes.
Now the auditor has to deal with confidential information all the time, I'm assuming.
Yes.
That doesn't mean he doesn't get to look at confidential files. It means he can't go off and give them to you or make them public, but he's got the right to look at these things.
And Denver Human Services is saying, in turn, I don't want to be the spokesperson, obviously, for Denver Human Services, but what they're saying in turn is that we get our funding primarily from federal and state sources, not from the city. So you know what? Thanks, but no thanks.
Really?
Interesting.
Well, then shouldn't the city just cut off all money to them?
Well, they don't get a lot of funding. I mean, the truth be told, Denver Human Services gets a lot of their funding. They do get a lot of their funding from state and federal sources. So the question is now going to have to be decided, perhaps by a judge, can you open this stuff up?
Or we'll have to ask the state auditor now to come in and take a look.
And this has been a frustrating part for journalists because journalists want to figure out, I want to know if the story that I'm doing is right. I think the auditor wants to know if the money he's spending is being right. Transparency is important, but maybe there's some other issues.
And a check and balance is important too. And at the center of this are kids who are getting hurt, and we need to find out how to make sure that doesn't happen in the future.
And that's been the goal for a number of people. I have no doubt there are amazing people that work for Denver Human Services that have great expectations.
Keep us involved in this story. I want to know it's got legs. Hey, thank you so much. You stay tuned. Let's talk about the ballot.